Moscow, August 1st, 1946. The corridors of Lubyanka, the notorious headquarters and internal prison of the Soviet secret police, are silent. But deep underground, the air is thick with the smell of damp concrete and cheap tobacco. 12 men stand in the shadows. Among them is Andrei Vlasov. Once, he was a hero of the Soviet Union, a man who personally saved Moscow from the Nazi onslaught. Now, he is a ghost, a Judas, a man about to be erased from history. Stalin never forgave, and he never forgot. But here is the mystery that still haunts the classified archives. Why did over 1 million Soviet citizens, led by decorated generals, choose to wear the uniform of their sworn enemy? Was it a crusade against a communist tyrant, or a desperate act of cowardice to escape the starving camps of the Gulag, the vast network of Soviet forced labor camps? Today, we peel back the layers of Soviet propaganda. We look at the interrogation transcripts from the NKVD, the ruthless predecessor to the KGB, to find the truth about the men who betrayed the Kremlin for the swastika. This is not just a story of war. This is a journey into the heart of betrayal. To understand why a general would betray his motherland, you first have to understand the world Stalin built. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union was a kingdom of glass. Everyone was watched. Everyone was a potential traitor. In 1937, Stalin launched the Great Purge, a systematic bloodbath designed to decapitate any potential opposition. He didn't just target politicians, he went for the heart of the military. Thousands of high-ranking officers were dragged from their beds in the middle of the night, accused of being German spies or Trotskyite saboteurs. This was the era of the NKVD troikas, special three-person commissions that bypassed the entire legal system. There were no defense lawyers, no evidence was required. A troika could review a list of 100 names and sentence them all to death in a single afternoon. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Red Army was led by men who were terrified. They weren't just afraid of the German panzers, they were afraid of their own shadows. In the first months of the war, millions of Soviet soldiers were trapped in kettles, massive encirclements where they were left to starve or surrender. For a Soviet general, being captured wasn't just a military failure. According to Stalin's order number 270, any soldier who surrendered was a deserter, and their families back home were subject to arrest. Imagine the choice: return to Stalin and face a firing squad, or join the enemy and fight for a different kind of survival. As an investigator, I have to ask, was it treason, or was it the only way to stay alive in a world gone mad? If you looked at a Soviet newspaper in early 1942, you'd see one face everywhere. It wasn't just Stalin, it was Lieutenant General Andrei Vlasov. He was the golden boy of the Red Army, a towering figure who had just led the 20th Army to push the Nazis back from the very gates of Moscow. Stalin loved him, the press adored him. He was a decorated hero of the Order of the Red Banner. But within months, this hero would become the most hated name in Russian history. How? Let's look at the evidence. The turning point was the Volkhov Front, a hellscape of swamps and frozen forests. Vlasov was given command of the Second Shock Army, their mission to break the siege of Leningrad. But the Soviet High Command, known as Stavka, made a fatal error. They pushed Vlasov's men into a narrow corridor, a bottleneck that the Germans quickly snapped shut. Imagine the scene. Thousands of Soviet soldiers trapped in a swamp, eating their own horses, then bark from trees, then worse. There was no ammo, no medicine. Vlasov sent desperate telegrams to Moscow, begging for a breakout. The response? Silence, or worse, suicidal orders to hold the line. The investigators note, this is where the narrative splits. Soviet propaganda says Vlasov was a coward who hid in a shed, but declassified German records tell a different story. For weeks, Vlasov wandered the woods, starving, refusing to abandon his men. In July 1942, he was finally captured in a small village. The German soldiers didn't even know who he was at first. He looked like a ghost. But instead of being executed, Vlasov was taken to a specialized prison camp for high-ranking officers in Dabendorf. It was there that the transformation began. Within months, the man who saved Moscow was signing the Smolensk Manifesto, a document calling for the overthrow of Stalin with the help of Nazi Germany. He helped form the ROA, the Russkaya Osvoboditelnaya Armia, or the Russian Liberation Army. They wore German-style tunics, but with a specific patch, the Blue Cross of St. Andrew. To Stalin, this was the ultimate noj v spinu, a knife in the back. But let's be skeptical for a moment. Did Vlasov truly believe he could use Hitler to liberate Russia? Or was he a broken man, manipulated by the Abwehr, German military intelligence, who realized that his only choice was to lead a puppet army or die in a hole? The documents show that Hitler himself never fully trusted Vlasov. He called him a Slavic subhuman in private. Vlasov was a general without a real army for years, a tragic figure caught between two of the most bloodthirsty dictators in history. He traded his soul for a chance to fight back against the man who had abandoned him in the swamps of Volkhov. If Andrei Vlasov was the tragic face of the defection, our next character is its darkest shadow. His name was Bronislav Kaminsky. He wasn't a career general of the Red Army, but he became something far more dangerous, a warlord with the power of life and death over 500,000 people. To understand Kaminsky, we have to look at a strange anomaly on the map of occupied Russia, the Lokot autonomy. While the rest of the Soviet Union was a battlefield, in a small region near Bryansk, the Nazis allowed a state within a state to exist, and Kaminsky was its king. He was an engineer who had been arrested by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, during the purges. He survived the labor camps, and when the Germans arrived, he didn't just welcome them, he offered them a deal. "I will keep this region quiet so you don't have to." He formed the Rona, the Russian National Liberation Army. At its peak, it was a force of 20,000 men, but don't let the name fool you. This wasn't a disciplined military unit. It was a private army of collaborators, former prisoners, and opportunists. The investigators' evidence, reports from the Abwehr, German military intelligence, described the Lokot autonomy as a place of absolute lawlessness. Kaminsky's men didn't just fight partisans, they requisitioned everything: food, livestock, women. Anyone suspected of loyalty to Moscow was liquidated on the spot, often without a word from the German high command. But the true horror of Kaminsky's legacy was written in the blood of the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. When the Polish Home Army rose up against the Nazis, Hitler sent in the Rona. What followed was a massacre so depraved that it shocked even the SS, the elite and most brutal paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party. Kaminsky's men ignored military objectives. Instead, they moved from house to house in the Okota district, engaging in mass rape, looting, and execution of civilians. The documents tell us that even Heinrich Himmler's subordinates were revolted. They reported that Kaminsky's troops were uncontrollable and beastly. The skeptics question, how does a man go from being a victim of Stalin's system to becoming a monster that disgusted the Nazis? Was this anti-communism, or was it a descent into pure psychopathic opportunism? Kaminsky's end was as cinematic as his rise. The Germans realized they couldn't control their own dog of war. In August 1944, they called him to a meeting. He was never seen again. The official Nazi report claimed he was killed by Polish partisans in an ambush. In reality, the SS had executed him. They even faked the ambush, riddling his car with bullets to cover up the fact that they had liquidated their own general. Even in the world of traitors, there was a limit to how much blood one man could spill. While men like Kaminsky were drowning in chaos, others were building a structured machine of war against Stalin. To understand the scale of this general's revolt, we have to look at two very different men, Fyodor Trukin and Ivan Kononov. One was the brain, the other was the blade. Fyodor Trukin was not a man of the trenches. He was an intellectual, a major general, and a former professor at the General Staff Academy. In the Red Army, he was the man who drew the maps and calculated the logistics. When he was captured in 1941, the Abwehr, German military intelligence, realized they hadn't just caught a soldier, they had caught a library of Soviet secrets. Trukin became the chief of staff for the defectors. He was the one who tried to turn a ragtag group of starving prisoners into a professional army. The investigators note, looking at Trukin's interrogation files, you see a cold, calculated logic. He didn't join Hitler out of fear. He joined because he believed the Soviet system was a mathematical error that needed to be deleted. He was the architect of the ROA's structure, trying to create a new Russia while wearing a Nazi uniform. a paradox that would eventually lead him to the gallows. But if Trukin was the mind, Ivan Kononov was the personification of an old, deep-seated vendetta. Kononov was a colonel in the Red Army, but he was also a Cossack, a member of a legendary elite warrior class known for their horsemanship and fierce independence. For centuries, the Cossacks had been the protectors of the Russian Empire, but after the 1917 revolution, they were targeted by the Bolsheviks for decossacization, a brutal policy of land seizure and mass executions. In August 1941, Kononov did something unthinkable. He didn't just defect, he took his entire 436th Regiment with him. He told his men, "I am going to fight the communists. Who is with me?" Almost every single man stepped forward. Kononov became the commander of the 5th Cossack Regiment under German command. For him, the Nazis were simply a means to an end, a tool to be used to reclaim the Don and Kuban regions from Stalin's grip. The skeptic's view. Here is the dark irony of the 20th century. To fight one genocidal dictator, these men joined another. Kononov's Cossacks were legendary for their bravery on the battlefield, but they were also used by the Germans for anti-partisan operations, which often meant burning villages and executing civilians in the Balkans and Ukraine. Can you call yourself a liberator when your paycheck comes from the Waffen-SS? Documents from the era show that Kononov was a man driven by a blood feud. He wasn't fighting for Hitler's New Order. He was fighting a ghost from 1917. But in the eyes of history and the eyes of Smersh, Stalin's counterintelligence units, there was no difference. They were all marked for liquidation. 1. The Third Reich is no longer an empire. It is a smoking tomb. As the Red Army smashes into Berlin, another war is being fought in the shadows. A war of shadows and silences. Enter Smersh, the elite Soviet counterintelligence umbrella, whose name is a brutal acronym for Smert Spionem, or Death to Spies. Their mission wasn't to take prisoners. It was to erase every trace of the general's defectors. But the traitors had a plan. Vlasov and his officers knew that surrendering to Stalin meant a slow death. They raced west, hoping to find sanctuary with the Americans and the British. They believed that the Western Allies would need them for the coming war against communism. They were wrong. In February 1945, at the Yalta Conference, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill signed a secret protocol. It was called Operation Keelhaul. The agreement was simple and cold. Every Soviet citizen found in the West was to be forcibly returned to the USSR. The investigators note, for many, this was the ultimate betrayal. Thousands of men who thought they were choosing freedom were loaded into trucks at bayonet point by British and American soldiers and handed directly to the waiting NKVD. Andrei Vlasov was captured in May 1945 near the city of Pilsen. He was hiding under a pile of blankets in a car, trying to reach the American lines. Instead, he was dragged out by Soviet tanks. For a year, the Vlasovites disappeared into the bowels of Lubyanka and Butyrka, the most feared transit prisons in Moscow. Stalin was terrified of a public trial. He didn't want these men to have a microphone. He didn't want the world to hear their reasons for turning against him. So, the trial was held behind closed doors. There were no cameras, no international observers, just a panel of military judges and a predetermined verdict. On August 1, 1946, the sentence was carried out. The grim detail. In the Soviet Union, generals were usually executed by a firing squad. It was considered a soldier's death. But for Vlasov and his inner circle, Stalin ordered something more humiliating. They were hanged. Some accounts suggest they were executed using piano wire, a slow, agonizing end designed to strip them of their last shred of dignity. Their bodies were cremated, and their ashes were dumped into a nameless pit. In the eyes of the Kremlin, they never existed. But as we look at the declassified files today, a question remains. Can you ever truly bury the truth, no matter how deep the grave? So, what is the final verdict on the Red defectors? As an investigator, I've looked through the classified reports of the KGB, the successor to Stalin's secret police, and the interrogation transcripts. The truth isn't black and white. It is a shade of blood red and ash gray. Was Andrei Vlasov a patriot who tried to save Russia from a monster, or a coward who traded his oath for a chance at survival? Was Bronislav Kaminsky a freedom fighter, or just a psychopath unleashed by the chaos of war? The sinister reality of the 20th century is that these men were caught between two of the most murderous regimes in human history. They chose the swastika to fight the hammer and sickle, believing they could control the fire. But as history shows, you cannot dance with a devil like Hitler and expect to keep your soul. In modern-day Russia, their names remain synonymous with predatelstvo, the ultimate act of betrayal. There are no monuments to them. Their final resting place is believed to be a mass grave at the Donskoy Cemetery in Moscow, a place where the Soviet state dumped the ashes of those it wanted the world to forget. But we shouldn't forget, not because these men were heroes, but because their story is a warning. It's a story of how extreme tyranny can drive even decorated heroes into the arms of the enemy. The documents are now back in the vaults. The names are crossed out in the ledgers of the NKVD, but the question still echoes through the corridors of the Lubyanka. In a world ruled by dictators, is there ever a right side to choose? Or are the soldiers always just pawns in a game of global liquidation? History has made its judgment. Now it's up to you to decide.